Imagine a time when a small kingdom, battered by constant invasions and internal strife, fought simply to survive. No grand aspirations, no dreams of empire. Yet, in the wild marshlands of England, a spark ignited a spark that would eventually light the path to the greatest empire the world has ever known. But how does a kingdom so small and isolated rise to control vast swaths of land, from the Americas to India? And, just as importantly, what happens when such an empire, once untouchable, begins to crumble? The story of the British Empire does not begin with grand battles or imperial aspirations. It begins with survival. In the late 9th century, the English kingdom was anything but unified. England was divided, vulnerable to Viking raids that threatened to tear it apart. The idea of a powerful empire seemed like a distant dream, far beyond the reach of this fractured and weakened nation. At the heart of this struggle stood a king, Alfred the Great, a man who would become one of the most significant figures in British history, not because of his ability to conquer or expand, but because of his ability to hold his kingdom together. With Viking hordes pressing on every side, Alfred's reign became a battle for survival rather than glory. Yet, it was this very battle that laid the foundation for England's eventual rise. Alfred didn't seek to conquer. Instead, he turned to one of the most powerful tools in history: adaptation. He sought refuge in the marshlands of Somerset, using the terrain's natural protection to withstand the Viking invaders. This early strategic retreat highlighted a crucial fact about the British Empire. It wasn't built on strength alone, but on the ability to endure, adapt, and survive when all seemed lost. Survival is not about strength, it is about resilience. This would become the defining theme for the centuries that followed. As the centuries rolled on, England would slowly evolve. From the dark marshlands where Alfred took refuge, the kingdom began to coalesce. What once seemed like an empire in the making, one forged in desperation and defensive war, gradually transformed into an ambitious, expansionist nation. But this wasn't an easy transition. England had to contend with internal struggles, centuries of Viking invasions, and the complex political landscapes of its neighbors. The monarchy, at first fragile, grew in strength. Alfred's successors began to unite the kingdom, laying the groundwork for what would eventually be known as the British Empire. However, there was no sudden leap from survival to dominance. It was a slow and steady process, marked by territorial expansion, cultural shifts, and political maneuvering. It wasn't until the late 15th century, nearly 600 years after Alfred's reign, that England would finally begin looking outward, beyond its borders, to stake its claim on the world stage. The first steps toward imperial ambition were hesitant, but they would eventually transform England into a global power. Fast forward to 1497. England, now a united kingdom, begins to assert its presence beyond the British Isles. The first tangible step in this new chapter came when John Cabot, an explorer sailing under the English flag, made landfall on what would become Newfoundland in Canada. This marked the first English claim in the Americas, and though it was a modest beginning, it was the spark of something much larger. But even then, empire was not the goal. At this stage, England was focused on survival and expanding its resources, securing trade routes, and defending its growing power against emerging global threats. The first English colonies were not well planned or stable. The mysterious disappearance of the Roanoke colony in 1587, often called the Lost Colony, stands as a stark reminder of the difficulties and risks of early colonial life. The early struggles of English settlers highlight the immense challenges of empire building. Colonies were often plagued by food shortages, disease, and hostile encounters with indigenous populations. Yet, despite these hardships, the drive to expand and secure resources was relentless. This early period in the empire's history reveals an important lesson. The foundation of empire was not just about military conquest, but about persistence in the face of failure, death, and adversity. By the late 16th century, the stage was set for England's transition from survival to imperial ambition. It was no longer just about defending the kingdom, it was about securing a future. With the rise of England's naval power, exemplified by the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the groundwork was laid for what would become one of the most formidable empires in history. But even as England expanded its territories, this expansion was far from simple. The costs of empire building were steep. Economic exploitation, military conquest, and cultural imposition all played pivotal roles. The people of the lands England claimed as colonies faced immeasurable suffering, from the brutal realities of the transatlantic slave trade to the displacements caused by British expansion in the Americas and India. This paradox, the juxtaposition of imperial wealth built on the backs of exploited peoples, would remain at the heart of the British Empire. Throughout its history, it would be both an empire of progress and of pain, of innovation and exploitation, of power and suffering, from the early struggles of Alfred the Great to the global empire that would span the globe. The British Empire's story is one of both triumph and tragedy. Its rise was not inevitable, nor was it painless. Every inch of land, every colony, came with its own set of challenges, military, cultural, and human. But as we journey through the centuries, we'll see how one small kingdom, born from the need to survive, became the largest empire the world has ever known. From the defeat of the Spanish Armada to the rise of the East India Company, from the birth of the slave trade to the shockwaves of the American Revolution, this is the story of how the British Empire was built not in grand gestures, but in moments of survival, resilience, and relentless ambition. Now that we've set the stage for the rise of the British Empire, let's rewind to its earliest days, the days of Alfred the Great, a king not of conquest, but of survival. It's a time when England was torn apart by Viking invasions, and the future of the kingdom seemed uncertain. Alfred's story is not one of empire building, but of defending the fragile existence of his people. How did he do it? And how did this fight for survival pave the way for England's future? Stay with us as we dive into the heart of England's struggle for survival, when it was more about holding on to what little was left than reaching for the stars. The history of the British Empire begins in an unexpected place, a divided and fractured kingdom on the brink of collapse. England, in the late 9th century, was not the unified powerhouse we know today, but a land struggling to hold itself together. The Roman legions had long since left, and what remained was a fractured land constantly under threat. Divided kingdoms Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, and East Anglia vied for power, while raiders from the north, the Vikings, sought to carve out their own dominion. The very idea of empire seemed far off. Survival was the order of the day. England's fate seemed sealed. The Viking raids were relentless, devastating towns and villages, and with every raid, the once proud Saxon kingdom appeared to be crumbling. In the chaos, local rulers found it difficult to unite, and the Saxon kingdoms had little ability to defend against the well-organized Viking forces. At the heart of this struggle was Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex, who would rise to become one of England's most celebrated rulers. In 871, when Alfred assumed the throne, The future of England was uncertain, its survival at risk. Little did the world know that this man, facing overwhelming odds, would lay the groundwork for what would become the British Empire. Alfred the Great was not a man born into a world of certainty. He faced the seemingly insurmountable task of defending his people from the terrifying Viking invasions that swept across the British Isles. The Vikings, who had come from the Nordic countries, were ruthless in their conquests, laying waste to towns and killing without mercy. England's fractured kingdoms were in disarray, unable to respond with any unified force. Alfred's initial strategy was not one of direct confrontation, but of survival strategic retreat. In 878, after suffering a crushing defeat at the Battle of Edington, Alfred fled to the marshlands of Somerset. Here, in the wild, uninhabitable swamps, he built a stronghold. The terrain offered natural protection against Viking pursuit, and it became the key to Alfred's survival. For nearly a year, he and his forces hid in these marshes, living off the land, regrouping and strategizing. It was from this refuge that Alfred would later emerge, stronger and more prepared to take back what was lost. This period of hiding may seem like a period of weakness, but it was actually a brilliant strategia, time to gather strength and plan for the future. Alfred knew that to defeat the Vikings, he would need more than just brute force. He needed a strategy, a way to use the land to his advantage. Alfred's return to the battlefield, following his time in the marshes, was a turning point. He eventually won a decisive victory over the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in 878, forcing the Viking leader Guthrum to accept Christianity and promise peace with the Saxons. This victory was not just a military triumph, but a psychological one. Alfred had turned what seemed like a desperate situation into a powerful symbol of resilience. Though Alfred's victory over the Vikings was significant, it didn't immediately bring peace to the land. England was still divided into smaller kingdoms, each with its own struggles and ambitions. The Kingdom of Wessex, under Alfred's rule, was the only major Saxon kingdom that stood strong. The rest of England remained fragmented, with the Viking forces controlling large parts of the land. Yet Alfred was not content to simply survive. He knew that England's future lay in unity. His vision for the kingdom was not merely to defend it from Viking incursions, but to forge a unified England. Alfred's strategy was to strengthen Wessex, build fortifications, and lay the foundations for a united kingdom. His most significant achievement was the creation of a system of fortified towns, known as burhs, which would help defend against future Viking invasions. These settlements not only acted as military fortresses, but also fostered economic growth and the development of trade. Through these measures, Alfred gradually consolidated his power and secured his kingdom. But more than that, he set the stage for the eventual unification of England. His successors would build on these foundations, eventually bringing all of England under one rule. Alfred the Great's legacy is not just in his military victories or his defensive strategies, but in the lasting impact he had on the formation of England itself. His reign set the stage for the rise of the English monarchy, and his vision of a unified kingdom would carry on through his descendants. After Alfred's death in 899, his son, Edward the Elder, and his grandson, Ethelstan, would continue his work, gradually uniting the various kingdoms of England. By 927, Ethelstan was recognized as the first king of all England, marking the culmination of Alfred's dream of a united kingdom. While Alfred never saw the full unification of England, his survival strategies, his focus on fortification and defense, and his vision for a unified kingdom laid the foundation for what would eventually become the British Empire. Through Alfred's leadership, the Kingdom of Wessex was able to survive the Viking invasions and become the heart of a united England. The ideas and innovations of his reign would set the course for England's future, leading to the gradual rise of the English monarchy and, eventually, the creation of an empire that spanned the globe. Alfred's reign was just the beginning of England's rise to power. After the unification of England under his successors, the stage was set for expansion. But England's rise would not be without its challenges. The kingdom would need to look beyond its borders, and in the coming centuries, it would begin to explore new territories, starting with the Americas. Next, we will explore how the ambitions of early English explorers, like John Cabot, laid the groundwork for England's colonial empire, while Alfred's England had fought for survival. The next phase of the empire's history would be defined by ambition, exploration, and the drive to expand England's reach across the globe. By the late 15th century, England had survived its internal strife and had begun to rebuild under the rule of Henry VII. With the threat of the Vikings and internal disunity behind them, England now set its sights outward, looking to expand beyond the island's shores. As Europe was in the midst of the age of exploration, the British monarchy realized the importance of securing overseas territories for trade, resources, and wealth. The first major step in this direction came in 1497 when John Cabot, an Italian navigator, set sail from England under the commission of King Henry VII. Cabot's mission was clear: find new lands to expand England's influence. On his voyage, he made landfall in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, though Cabot didn't know it at the time. This would mark England's first claim in the Americas. This early exploration was driven by the desire for new trade routes, as well as the economic benefits of discovering and exploiting resources. But while Cabot's journey didn't immediately lead to colonies, it was symbolic. His voyage marked England's formal entry into the competition for empire building, signaling to the world that England had global ambitions. However, Cabot's expedition didn't yield immediate riches or land, and England's colonization efforts remained mostly dormant for the next century. It was clear that colonization was not a simple or risk-free venture, as the challenges of long voyages and unknown territories posed serious threats to early explorers. The next major attempt at colonization came toward the end of the 16th century with Sir Walter Raleigh's expedition to the New World. Raleigh was an ambitious figure in Elizabethan England, eager to extend England's reach and create a permanent foothold in North America. In 1585, Raleigh sponsored the establishment of the Roanoke colony on the coast of present-day North Carolina. This settlement, though one of the first attempts by the English to establish a permanent colony, faced severe hardships from the outset. The settlers faced disease, food shortages, and constant conflict with the indigenous populations. The climate and unfamiliar terrain made survival difficult, and many settlers found themselves ill-prepared for the harsh realities of life in the New World. In 1587, Raleigh sent a second group of settlers to Roanoke, led by John White. White returned to England to seek more supplies, but upon his return 3 years later, the colony had vanished without a trace. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a tree, hinting that the settlers may have been taken or forced to move elsewhere. The mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke remains unsolved, but it served as a stark reminder of the difficulties of colonization. Despite Roanoke's failure, the seeds for English colonization had been sown. England now understood that establishing a successful colony required not just courage and ambition, but substantial resources and careful planning. The failure of Roanoke wouldn't deter future colonization efforts. Instead, it revealed just how challenging and complex empire building could be. In 1607, Virginia would become the first English colony to successfully take root in the New World. The Jamestown colony, named after King James I, was established by the Virginia Company, a joint stock company aimed at making a profit by extracting resources from the Americas. Unlike Roanoke, which had been poorly supported, Jamestown received more substantial funding and a more organized effort, however. The colony's early years were far from successful. The first settlers at Jamestown, many of whom were gentlemen, unused to hard labor, expected easy riches from the land. They were ill-prepared for the hardships they would face: disease, starvation, and conflicts with the indigenous Powhatan Confederacy were constant threats. In fact, it wasn't until the leadership of Captain John Smith, who famously imposed the rule, "He who does not work shall not eat," that the colony began to survive. Jamestown's survival was also dependent on the arrival of crucial supplies, including food and reinforcements from England. But even with these improvements, the colony was still on the brink of collapse. It was only with the introduction of tobacco cultivation in the 1610s that Jamestown began to stabilize. Tobacco became the colony's cash crop, providing the economic foundation necessary for its continued existence. Yet, the prosperity of Jamestown came at a terrible cost. The expansion of English settlements in Virginia, driven by the desire for tobacco, led to violent conflicts with the indigenous Powhatan tribes. These clashes would set the tone for much of the colonial experience in North America, a struggle for land, resources, and dominance. One of the darkest chapters in England's early colonial history is the development of the slave trade. As the colonies expanded, particularly in the Caribbean and the southern colonies of North America, the demand for labor grew exponentially. England's growing empire depended heavily on the use of enslaved Africans to work on plantations cultivating tobacco, sugar, and cotton. The first African slaves were brought to Jamestown in 1619, marking the beginning of England's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. The system was built on cruelty and exploitation. Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands, shipped across the Atlantic in brutal conditions, and sold into slavery on plantations. The slave trade became a central part of England's colonial economy, driving the growth of industries that would generate immense wealth for the empire. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco fields in Virginia and Maryland flourished thanks to the labor of enslaved people. This wealth was a major factor in the expansion of the empire, but it was also built on unimaginable human suffering. Over the next 2 centuries, the British Empire would become the leading force in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting an estimated 3.1 million Africans to the Americas, contributing to the empire's economic power but leaving a legacy of cruelty and oppression that still affects societies today. While economic motives drove much of England's colonial expansion, religious tensions at home also played a role. In the early 17th century, England was experiencing significant religious upheaval. The Church of England, established by Henry VIII, had created a Protestant nation, but not all Protestants were satisfied. The Puritans, a group of radical reformers, believed that the Church had not gone far enough in its reforms and sought to purify it further, facing persecution in England. Many Puritans sought to establish colonies in the Americas, where they could practice their religion freely. The Pilgrims, a group of separatist Puritans, famously sailed aboard the Mayflower in 1620, landing in Plymouth, Massachusetts. They were not seeking riches, but the freedom to worship without interference from the Church of England. Their story is often romanticized as one of religious freedom and perseverance. Though their settlement was far from easy, the arrival of the Pilgrims in Plymouth began the pattern of religious colonization that would become a significant part of England's American empire. The Puritans' settlement in Massachusetts would follow, creating a strong theocratic society that shaped the future of New England. While the English Empire expanded its territorial claims across the globe, colonization was not a simple, straightforward endeavor. The process was fraught with failures, hardships, and injustices, from the early failures of Roanoke to the violent conflicts with indigenous peoples. Colonization was shaped by a complex interplay of ambition, survival, and exploitation. England's empire was built on a delicate balance of economic opportunity, religious motivations, and the ruthless exploitation of both land and people. For the indigenous populations, this period marked the beginning of a long and painful history of displacement and suffering. For the English settlers, it was a chance to secure wealth and prosperity, but one that came at a great cost, both to themselves and to others. The foundations of the British Empire were now laid. What began as tentative steps toward global expansion would soon grow into one of the largest and most powerful empires in history. In the coming centuries, the empire would spread to the Caribbean, Africa, India, and the Americas. As the empire expanded, so too would the complexity of its legacy, marked by both tremendous wealth and deep human suffering. Next, we will explore how England's naval power and the need for resources fueled its colonial ambitions, leading to conflicts, wars, and even the rise of the East India Company. The stage is set for a period of rapid growth and intense global competition that would reshape the world. By the end of the 16th century, England was poised for a dramatic shift in its place within the world. The age of exploration and early colonization had set the stage for England's future ambitions, but what was missing? The key ingredient that would allow the tiny island nation to rival the great naval powers of Spain, Portugal, and France. Naval supremacy. England, unlike Spain, did not have an immense fleet to begin with. However, the naval challenges of the 1500s would catalyze the creation of one of the most formidable navies in history. The shift from a small, defensive fleet to a large, offensive naval force began under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. By the late 16th century, England had evolved from a relatively small naval presence to the spearhead of maritime power. England's early naval efforts were not just about defense. They were about establishing dominance on the high seas. The critical turning point came with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Spain, at the time, was the most powerful naval force in Europe, and its armada was seen as an unstoppable force. The Spanish king, Philip II, sought to invade England, eliminate Protestantism, and restore Catholicism, setting the stage for one of the most iconic naval conflicts in history. The Spanish Armada was a fleet of 130 ships, manned by 30,000 men, designed to invade England and restore Catholic rule. The fleet was vast, formidable, and well supplied, while England's navy numbered just a fraction of the Spanish force. In fact, the English had only about 60 ships, but what they lacked in size, they made up for in strategy, agility, and innovation. Led by Admiral Lord Howard of Effingham and the famed Sir Francis Drake. The English navy was agile and swift, employing innovative tactics that would turn the tide in their favor. The most important of these innovations was the use of fire. Ships' vessels set on fire and sent into the heart of the Spanish fleet. This caused panic and disorder among the Spanish ranks, who had been expecting a traditional battle, as the English ships maneuvered around the Spanish fleet with speed and precision. The weather played its part, with violent storms striking just after the initial clash, forcing the remaining Spanish ships to retreat. The defeat of the Armada was not just a military victory. It was a symbolic moment in English history, showcasing the power of the Navy and solidifying England's position as a rising naval power. But the defeat of the Spanish Armada was more than just a military victory. It was a turning point in the balance of power in Europe. It signified the decline of Spain's dominance and the rise of England as a maritime superpower, one that would go on to challenge and eventually surpass the great empires of the era. Following the victory over the Spanish Armada, England's naval dominance took off. England's newfound confidence on the high seas ushered in an era of naval exploration, privateering, and expansion. With Spain's influence waning, England began to establish its own maritime empire. And it wasn't long before the English Navy started to build its global presence. Sir Francis Drake, one of England's most famous privateers, became an icon of England's naval expansion. In 1577, he set off on an expedition that would make him the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. His ventures weren't just exploratory drakes. Missions often involved plundering Spanish colonies and ships, which severely weakened Spain's wealth and power. His raids also laid the foundation for England's growing economic strength, which would later fund the expansion of its empire. At the same time, England began to lay the groundwork for a permanent colonial empire. English explorers and traders began to chart new routes to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, establishing settlements, trade routes, and colonies that would fuel England's economic growth. With a superior navy, England could now defend and expand its territories with ease, securing vital resources like gold, silver, tobacco, and sugar. By the early 17th century, England's naval prowess was firmly established, and its reach was extending far beyond the shores of the Americas. In 1600, the East India Company was formed, marking the beginning of English imperial ambitions in Asia. This joint stock company would be one of the most significant drivers of British expansion, eventually controlling vast territories in India and Asia. The East India Company was initially created to capitalize on the lucrative spice trade, but it quickly became much more than a commercial venture. It was the military and political arm of the British Empire in the East. The company had its own army, which it used to defend British interests, and its influence grew rapidly as it took control of vast regions of India, Southeast Asia, and China. The establishment of the East India Company provided the British Empire with the economic resources to expand its power globally. The company was responsible for creating the colonial economies in India that would provide Britain with immense wealth. The profits from the spice and cotton trade, as well as the exploitation of Indian resources, would fund Britain's military endeavors and fuel its imperial ambitions across the globe. This era also saw the rise of plantation economies in the Caribbean, South America, and North America. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations drove the need for labor often provided by enslaved Africans. These plantations, along with the wealth generated by the East India Company, were crucial to the expansion of the British Empire. The wealth from these colonial economies fueled further exploration and military expansion, cementing England's place as a global power. As the 17th century progressed, England's navy grew stronger, and its influence around the world expanded. The naval victories over the Spanish Armada were just the beginning. The English Navy would go on to dominate the seas, establishing trade routes and ensuring British control of key territories in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. The Royal Navy became the cornerstone of the British Empire's success, providing both military might and economic strength. By the 18th century, the British Navy had become the most powerful in the world, capable of projecting power to every corner of the globe. This naval supremacy was crucial during conflicts like the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which solidified British dominance over much of North America and India. The dominance of the British Navy also played a pivotal role in protecting England's merchant fleets, which transported vital goods and resources back to Britain. The Navy ensured that British merchants could operate freely across the world's oceans, expanding trade and securing Britain's position as the center of global commerce. With naval power established, England's next challenge was to consolidate its overseas possessions and transform them into a true empire. The British Navy had won the seas, and now it was time for England to assert its control over vast swaths of land. The story of English expansion, however, was not just about military superiority. It was also about strategic alliances, trade monopolies, and the exploitation of resources. The British Empire's rise was shaped by a complex web of factors: naval power, economic ambition, and political maneuvering, each contributing to its ultimate dominance on the global stage. Next, we'll delve into how England's imperial policies, military might, and economic strategies would fuel its expansion into Africa and India, leading to the establishment of one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. Began to skyrocket. In the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean and the southern colonies of North America, the growth of plantation economies, primarily sugar, tobacco, and cotton, created an insatiable need for cheap labor. The vast, fertile lands of the New World were ideal for cash crop production, but the settlers faced a harsh reality. The indigenous populations, decimated by disease and warfare, were not enough to supply the labor needed. In this context, the British Empire turned to an incredibly dark chapter in its history: the transatlantic slave trade. England, alongside Portugal and Spain, became one of the primary European powers involved in the forced transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas. This trade wasn't just about the brutal transportation of human beings across the Atlantic. It was the backbone of England's colonial economy. In 1562, John Hawkins became one of the first Englishmen to engage in the transatlantic slave trade, taking Africans from West Africa to the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Though Hawkins was a privateer and initially raided Spanish ships, his involvement in the slave trade marked the beginning of England's long and profitable participation in this horrific industry. By the 17th century, the British were heavily involved in what would be known as the Middle Passage, the journey of enslaved Africans from their homeland to the Americas, where they would be sold into slavery. The first recorded shipment of enslaved Africans to the British colonies in North America arrived in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. Over the next centuries, England's role in the transatlantic slave trade grew exponentially. The British were responsible for transporting an estimated 1 million Africans to the Americas, and the profits from this trade helped fuel the expansion of the British Empire. The impact of the slave trade on the British Empire was both profound and horrifying. Slavery became the economic engine that powered the empire's growth. The vast plantations in the Caribbean, South America, and the southern colonies of North America were built on the backs of enslaved Africans, whose labor produced the crops, sugar, tobacco, and cotton that were in high demand throughout Europe. The wealth generated from slavery flowed back to Britain, where it funded the expansion of the empire and its military. The profits from the slave trade and the commodities produced by enslaved labor were reinvested in British industries, leading to the rapid growth of cities like London and Bristol, which became key centers of trade. The British economy was deeply entwined with the suffering of millions of enslaved people. English merchants, shipbuilders, and bankers all profited from the slave trade, which became a vital part of the country's economic structure. In the Caribbean, for example, the sugar plantations relied entirely on enslaved labor. By the 18th century, the British Caribbean islands, particularly Jamaica and Barbados, became some of the wealthiest colonies in the empire due to their sugar exports. The plantations were brutal. The enslaved Africans worked long hours in dangerous conditions, and their mortality rate was high due to disease, malnutrition, and overwork. However, the wealth generated by these colonies was essential to the British Empire's growth. Despite the economic prosperity generated by slavery, the practice was not without controversy. By the late 18th century, growing opposition to the slave trade began to take root in Britain. Abolitionists, such as William Wilberforce and Granville Sharp, began campaigning against the moral and human costs of the transatlantic slave trade. The movement was fueled by the Enlightenment ideals of human rights and equality, as well as the growing awareness of the brutality of slavery. Yet, the abolition movement was met with fierce resistance. Many in Britain, especially those who profited from the slave trade and colonial plantations, defended the system, arguing that it was necessary for the empire's survival and prosperity. The economic interests of the slave trade were deeply entrenched in British society, and it wasn't easy to challenge the status quo. Nevertheless, the voices of abolitionists grew louder, and public sentiment began to shift. In 1807, after years of campaigning, the Slave Trade Act was passed, making it illegal to engage in the slave trade within the British Empire. This was a significant victory for the abolitionist movement, but it did not end slavery itself. Enslaved Africans continued to toil in the British colonies until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which finally freed enslaved people in most parts of the empire. However, the abolition of the slave trade did not come without consequences. Many of the British who had benefited from slavery were reluctant to let go of the system that had generated so much wealth. As a result, the British government provided compensation to slave owners for the loss of their property. In total, the British government paid out £20 million, equivalent to billions today, to compensate slave owners, sum that was only fully paid off in 2015. This illustrates how deeply slavery and the empire were intertwined, with the consequences of colonial exploitation still being felt long after its official end. The Caribbean was at the heart of the British Empire's profitable colonial system. Sugar, in particular, became the lifeblood of the British colonies in the region. The production of sugar required vast amounts of labor, which led to the importation of enslaved Africans in large numbers. On the islands of Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, the brutal system of plantation slavery was entrenched. The sugar plantations were vast, and the work was grueling. The enslaved population was subjected to back-breaking labor in the sugar mills and fields, and the mortality rate was shockingly high. It is estimated that 1/3 of the enslaved people brought to the Caribbean died within 3 years due to the harsh conditions. Despite this, sugar became the primary export for the British Caribbean colonies. the wealth generated from sugar plantations made England one of the wealthiest nations in the world. The colonies were essential to Britain's imperial dominance, both economically and strategically. The British Navy protected the sugar trade, ensuring that the flow of wealth from the Caribbean continued without interruption. The legacy of the British Empire's involvement in the slave trade is far-reaching. It shaped not only the empire's economic development, but also its social and political structures. The wealth generated by slavery allowed Britain to build the infrastructure that would support its global ambitions. The profits from the slave trade funded the expansion of the British Navy, the growth of cities like London and Bristol, and the establishment of British industries. However, the human cost of this system was immense. Millions of Africans were taken from their homes, shipped across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, and subjected to unimaginable suffering. The British Empire's role in the slave trade is a dark chapter in its history, one that continues to affect the descendants of enslaved people today. The empire's exploitation of human labor was not only a key factor in its rise, but also a source of deep moral conflict that would ultimately lead to its abolition. While the British Empire was growing increasingly wealthy through its colonies and the slave trade, tensions were brewing on the global stage. The wealth generated by the colonies gave Britain the resources to expand its military, but it also created new conflicts, both internal and external. As the empire expanded, so did the political and economic pressures to maintain control over these vast territories. In the next act, we will explore how the British Empire became embroiled in global conflicts, particularly in North America and India. These conflicts, including the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, would have far-reaching consequences for the British Empire and would ultimately lead to a re-evaluation of its global strategies. By the early 18th century, the British Empire was well on its way to becoming a global power. Its wealth, driven by its colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean, had allowed the empire to expand its reach into Asia. However, England's ambitions in India marked a new chapter in its imperial history. India was rich in resources, spices, textiles, and precious metals, and the British were eager to tap into this immense wealth. The catalyst for British control in India was the formation of the East India Company in 1600. This joint stock company, initially established for trade, would become one of the most powerful institutions in the empire. It was a powerful force that operated not just as a commercial enterprise, but as a military and political entity, with its own army and extensive influence over Indian politics. Its monopoly on trade in the East allowed it to control vast portions of India and exert significant power over local rulers. In the beginning, the East India Company's focus was on trade. The company established trading posts in key Indian cities such as Calcutta, now Kolkata, Madras, now Chennai, and Bombay, now Mumbai. These coastal cities, with their proximity to valuable trading routes, allowed the British to control the lucrative spice trade, as well as cotton, silk, and opium. But trade alone was not enough for the ambitious British. The desire for direct political control over India's vast resources would soon become apparent. The pivotal moment that marked the beginning of British dominance in India was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. This battle, fought between the forces of the East India Company and the Bengali Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah, was not just a military conflict, but a political maneuver that would reshape India's future. The East India Company, led by Robert Clive, faced off against the forces of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who had sought to expel the British from Bengal and assert his control over the region, despite being outnumbered. Clive's forces emerged victorious. This was not just due to military prowess, but because of political intrigue and strategic alliances. Clive had managed to bribe key officials in Siraj Daugh's court, leading to defections that weakened the Nawab's forces. The battle was a resounding victory for the East India Company, and it marked the beginning of British control over the richest province in India. The aftermath of Plassey saw the East India Company installing a puppet ruler, Mir Jafar, who was sympathetic to British interests. This victory demonstrated the company's ability to manipulate local politics and expand its control over Indian territories without having to rely solely on military force. The British began to use indirect rule, relying on local rulers who could be controlled through political alliances and economic pressures. This strategy would become a hallmark of British imperial rule in India. After Plassey, the East India Company expanded its power across India, using both military force and diplomatic maneuvering. Over the next century, the company gained control over vast territories, including Bengal, Bombay, Madras, and later, much of northern and central India. British dominance in India wasn't just about territorial expansion. It was about reshaping the Indian economy to serve British interests. The British introduced new land revenue systems that benefited the empire but often left Indian peasants impoverished. The Permanent Settlement of 1793, implemented in Bengal, was one such policy. It fixed land taxes at exorbitant rates, placing immense pressure on the peasants who were already struggling to survive. This policy was a major cause of famines and economic instability in India, as the landowners, who were now loyal to the British, were able to collect large sums of money without investing in the land or the well-being of the local population. Meanwhile, the British restructured India's economy to serve imperial needs. They introduced cash crops like cotton and indigo, which were grown on plantations worked by Indian labor. This shift from subsistence farming to cash crop production weakened local economies and turned India into a supplier of raw materials for British factories. The Industrial Revolution in Britain relied heavily on Indian resources: cotton for textiles, indigo for dyes, and jute for rope, leading to the further impoverishment of India's rural population. The British presence in India wasn't just economic, it was cultural. The British brought with them a sense of superiority, driven by the belief in their civilizing mission. They sought to modernize India, often through the imposition of British cultural norms, educational systems, and legal structures. The British introduced English as the language of administration, education, and governance, leading to a shift in the intellectual life of India. British rule also brought about the spread of Christianity, though this was a source of conflict with India's indigenous religions. Christian missionaries sought to convert the local population, leading to tensions with both Hindus and Muslims. The British saw themselves as the bearers of civilization, believing that their presence in India was a noble effort to bring order to a chaotic, backward land. However, this view was deeply racist and disregarded India's rich cultural, religious, and intellectual traditions. The imposition of British values and education systems also created a new class of educated Indians who, for the first time, could directly interact with the British rulers. This educated elite would eventually play a crucial role in the rise of Indian nationalism, laying the groundwork for the struggle for independence in the 20th century. As British power grew in India, resistance began to emerge from various indigenous groups who opposed the foreign rule. The Maratha Empire, once a powerful force in western India, resisted British encroachment in their territories. Though the Marathas were eventually defeated in the Third Anglo-Maratha War 1817 to 1818, their resistance exposed the vulnerability of British control and the potential for large-scale uprisings. In the north, the Sikh Empire, led by Ranjit Singh, posed a significant challenge to British expansion in the Punjab region. Though Ranjit Singh's empire was eventually annexed by the British in the mid-19th century, the Sikhs fiercely resisted British rule. These regional powers were not easily subdued, and their opposition forced the British to invest heavily in military campaigns and garrisons across the subcontinent. Another important source of resistance came from the Mughal Empire. Although the Mughals had lost much of their power by the time the British arrived, they still controlled vast areas of northern India. The British were careful to manage the relationship with the Mughal emperor, using him as a puppet ruler for much of the 18th century. However, the Mughals' declining power was a source of instability, and British control often came at the cost of suppressing local rulers and dynasties. By the mid-19th century, the East India Company had grown so powerful that it was effectively running much of India as a British colony, but the company's brutal rule came under increasing scrutiny in Britain, especially after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, often referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny. This uprising, triggered by grievances over British rule, sparked widespread unrest across northern and central India. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but it marked the end of the East India Company's rule over India. In 1858, following the rebellion, the British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India. India became a British colony, officially ruled by the British Raj, under the authority of the Crown. The transition from company rule to imperial rule marked the beginning of a new phase of British control, one in which India would be seen as the jewel and the crown of the British Empire. Though British control of India was now firmly entrenched, the effects of centuries of exploitation were beginning to take their toll. The economic extraction, cultural suppression, and the growing political unrest sowed the seeds of future resistance. The stage was set for India's eventual push for independence, a struggle that would last for nearly a century, but would ultimately result in the dismantling of one of the world's greatest empires in the next act. We will explore the growing resistance to British rule, including the rise of nationalism and the events that led to India's independence in 1947. The British Empire, once at its peak, would soon begin its slow unraveling. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire was at its zenith. Its power stretched across continents, from India to the Americas, and the British Navy controlled the seas. However, in its farthest territories, particularly in the American colonies, the seeds of resistance were beginning to sprout. The once loyal American colonies had become increasingly discontented with British rule. What had begun as a relationship of mutual benefit was evolving into one marked by resentment, inequality, and frustration. The American colonies were accustomed to a certain degree of autonomy. For most of the 17th and early 18th centuries, Britain had exercised relatively little direct control over the colonies, allowing them to develop their own economies, governments, and identities. But as Britain's debts mounted following the 7 Years' War 1756 to 1763, which was fought in part to protect its American colonies from French and indigenous forces, the British government began to enforce stricter control over its colonial possessions. It needed money to pay for the war and to fund its expanding empire, and the colonies were seen as a convenient source of revenue. The first major spark in the rising discontent came with the imposition of new taxes on the American colonies. Britain, now financially burdened by the 7 Years' War, needed to recoup its losses. The British Parliament passed a series of acts designed to generate revenue from the colonies, most famously the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed all paper goods, including newspapers and legal documents. This was followed by the Townshend Acts in 1767, which imposed duties on glass, lead tea, and other goods imported into the colonies. The colonists saw these taxes as not only unjust, but also as an affront to their rights as Englishmen. They argued that, because they had no representation in Parliament, they should not be subject to British taxes. The slogan "No Taxation Without Representation" became a rallying cry for the colonists, signaling their growing political consciousness and their desire for independence. The colonists began to organize protests, and in many cases they resisted British policies with acts of civil disobedience. In 1773, tensions reached a boiling point with the Boston Tea Party, a direct response to the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. In a bold protest, American colonists, disguised as native Americans, boarded British ships and threw an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor, marking a symbolic and dramatic step toward rebellion. The British government responded harshly to these acts of defiance. The coercive acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, in the colonies were passed in 1774, closing Boston's port and stripping Massachusetts of its local government. The colonists saw these measures as punitive and tyrannical, and support for rebellion spread quickly throughout the 13 colonies. The conflict between Britain and its colonies had escalated beyond protests to open hostilities in April 1775. The first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord, where British troops clashed with colonial militias. The colonies quickly organized their forces, and the Continental Congress convened to manage the rebellion and seek alliances with foreign powers, particularly France. The Revolutionary War had begun, and Britain now found itself in a conflict it had not anticipated, fighting against its own colonies. The American Revolution was not just a military conflict, it was also a political struggle that involved the entire fabric of British imperial control. Britain had underestimated the resolve of the American colonists, who were not simply fighting for independence, but for a new vision of government and society. The British forces, while larger and better equipped, were stretched thin. Fighting a war thousands of miles from home presented immense logistical challenges. The American forces, led by General George Washington, employed guerrilla tactics and made effective use of their knowledge of the land. Britain's strategy of conventional warfare was ineffective in the dense forests and difficult terrain of the American colonies. Additionally, the British Army faced difficulties in managing their supply lines, dealing with the harsh weather, and maintaining morale among their troops. On the other hand, the American cause received vital support from France, who saw an opportunity to weaken their long-standing rival, Britain. France provided military aid, including soldiers, weapons, and naval support, which proved to be a decisive factor in the outcome of the war. The Battle of Saratoga in 1777 was a turning point where the American victory convinced France to formally enter the war on the side of the colonies. The American Revolution reached its climax in 1781 with the surrender of the British Army at the Siege of Yorktown. The French Navy played a crucial role in preventing British reinforcements from reaching their army, and the combined American and French forces forced General Lord Cornwallis to surrender. This defeat effectively ended the war, though fighting continued in some areas for another year. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the independence of the United States of America. For Britain, this was a devastating loss. Not only had it lost its most prosperous and populous colony, but the rebellion also challenged the legitimacy of British imperial power. The loss of the American colonies marked the beginning of the end for Britain's colonial dominance in North America. However, the loss was not solely a military defeat, it was a political and cultural blow. For over a century, Britain had seen itself as the most powerful empire in the world. The defeat in America exposed the weaknesses of the British imperial system and raised questions about the future of its global ambitions. Britain had learned a bitter lesson. Colonial control could no longer be taken for granted. The American Revolution did more than just sever a colony from the British Empire. It had a lasting impact on the broader system of imperialism. The war highlighted the vulnerabilities of colonial control, and British authorities would have to rethink their approach to governance and colonization in other parts of the empire. In the immediate aftermath of the Revolution, Britain focused on consolidating its hold on its remaining colonies. The loss of the American colonies also led to the development of new strategies for imperial management, particularly the use of indirect rule, which had already been implemented in places like India. The British Empire would begin to rely more heavily on alliances with local rulers and economic incentives rather than direct military control. The loss of the American colonies was a blow to British imperial pride, but the empire would continue to expand elsewhere, most notably in India and Africa. However, the seeds of change were already being sown. The American Revolution not only shifted the geopolitical landscape, but also ignited new ideas about liberty, self-governance, and nationalism. The events in America would inspire revolutionary movements across the globe, challenging colonial empires everywhere. In the next act, we will explore how Britain's increasing involvement in global conflicts, including the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimean War, reshaped the British Empire, leading to further expansions and the eventual decline of its colonial system. The 19th century heralded a period of profound transformation for Britain. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century, would forever change the landscape of the British Empire. Powered by advances in machinery, steam engines, and the development of new technologies, Britain's industries surged ahead of the rest of the world. The newfound industrial might, combined with Britain's established naval supremacy, created the perfect conditions for the empire's expansion on a scale never before seen. By the early 1800s, Britain had become the workshop of the world. The country's factories were producing goods at an unprecedented rate, from textiles and coal to iron and steel. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool became the heart of industrial Britain, while rural areas, once dominated by agriculture, transformed into hubs of factory-based production. The rapid industrialization created a surge in demand for raw materials, fueling Britain's desire to secure access to resources from its colonies. With its factories now churning out goods at an incredible pace, Britain needed a steady supply of raw materials like cotton, rubber, and minerals, which could only be found in abundance in its colonies. As a result, the Industrial Revolution became inextricably linked to British imperialism. The empire was no longer just about land and military conquest. It was now about economic dominance and resource extraction on a global scale. One of the most significant impacts of the Industrial Revolution on the British Empire was the intensification of the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. The technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution, particularly the steam engine, made it easier for Britain to penetrate the heart of Africa, a continent previously seen as difficult to navigate due to its vast interior and lack of infrastructure. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which was attended by European powers, including Britain, divided Africa into spheres of influence. The goal was to establish colonies where European powers could extract raw materials to feed their factories and new industries. For Britain, Africa was rich with resources such as gold, diamonds, rubber, and ivory materials, vital to sustaining its industrial economy. The British Empire's imperial appetite expanded to include vast territories across Africa, including Egypt, South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. The British presence in Africa was often justified with the rhetoric of civilizing the native populations, a sentiment that would be used to justify the exploitation of the continent's people and resources. The development of railroads and steamships, alongside the rise of colonial governments, enabled Britain to control vast areas of land. However, as the British pushed deeper into Africa, they encountered resistance, leading to violent confrontations with indigenous groups. In South Africa, the discovery of diamonds in 1867 and gold in the 1880s drove the British to expand their influence, eventually resulting in the Boer War 1899 to 1902 against Dutch settlers in the region. The war's brutal tactics, such as the use of concentration camps, exposed the darker side of British imperialism. While Britain won the war, it revealed the moral contradictions of the empire and sparked growing criticisms of its imperial practices. While Africa was a primary focus of British imperial ambitions in the late 19th century, Asia specifically, China was equally important. By the early 1800s, the British were keen to establish a foothold in China to expand their trade. The British had been importing tea, silk, and porcelain from China for years, but they had little to offer in return, leaving Britain with a trade imbalance. This imbalance was addressed in a shocking and controversial way: the opium trade. Opium, a narcotic produced in British-controlled India, became the product that Britain used to balance its trade with China. The British East India Company began smuggling opium into China, and by the 1830s, millions of Chinese were addicted to the drug. In an attempt to curtail the opium trade, the Qing dynasty of China took a hard stance, and in 1839, the Chinese government destroyed an opium shipment, leading to the outbreak of the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. The war was devastating for China, as Britain's superior navy and modern weaponry easily defeated Chinese forces. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, forced China to open 5 ports to British trade and cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain. A second Opium War in 1856 further humiliated China and expanded British control in the region. These wars revealed the brutal hypocrisy of British imperialism. While the British condemned opium use in their own country, they forced it upon China as a means of securing economic profit. The Opium Wars exemplified the darker side of British imperial expansion, an economic system that was driven by exploitation and that prioritized profit over human lives. China, once a powerful empire, was now at the mercy of European powers, including Britain. While British imperialism was expanding across Africa and Asia, British rule in India remained the crown jewel of the empire. By the mid-19th century, the East India Company had cemented British control over large parts of India, particularly after the Battle of Plassey, 1757. However, this control came at a great cost. As tensions with the local population simmered beneath the surface, The Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, marked a critical turning point in the history of British rule in India. The rebellion was sparked by grievances among Indian soldiers, sepoys in the British East India Company's army, who were upset over the use of new rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with beef and pork, fat offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The rebellion quickly spread across northern and central India, with Indians of all walks of life rising up against British rule. The mutiny was brutally suppressed, and the aftermath saw the British government take direct control of India, formally ending the rule of the East India Company. The British Raj was born, and Britain now ruled India directly as a colony. The rebellion exposed the growing dissatisfaction with British rule, and the fear of further uprisings led to a reorganization of the colonial system. The British Raj would last until 1947, but the seeds of resistance had already been planted. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It spanned vast territories across the globe, from Canada and the Caribbean to Africa, India, and the Pacific. The phrase "the sun never sets on the British Empire" became a symbol of its vastness and dominance. The British Empire's success was built on a combination of military might, economic control, and a global network of colonies. The Industrial Revolution had made Britain the world's most powerful industrial nation, and its vast network of colonies provided it with the raw materials and markets necessary for continued growth. Britain's naval supremacy ensured that its trade routes were secure, while the empire's reliance on local rulers allowed it to maintain control over vast swaths of territory with minimal direct involvement. However, the empire was not without its contradictions. While it brought wealth and power to Britain, it also caused suffering and exploitation across its colonies. The legacy of British imperialism remains complex, with enduring impacts on the countries it ruled. The British Empire, at its peak, seemed untouchable, but beneath its surface, cracks were beginning to form. The expansionist policies, the exploitation of colonies, and the growing resistance movements in India, Africa, and beyond would eventually lead to the empire's downfall. In the next act, we will explore the decline of the British Empire, beginning with the challenges posed by the First World War, the rise of nationalist movements in the colonies, and the economic pressures that would unravel the empire's colonial system. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood at its peak. It was a global superpower, commanding vast territories across every continent. Yet, beneath this towering edifice of power, the foundations were beginning to weaken. The First World War, 1914–1918, would be the first major event that exposed the vulnerabilities of the British Empire. The war placed an immense strain on Britain, both economically and militarily. It involved a significant portion of the empire's resources, and many of its colonies contributed to the war effort in the form of soldiers, supplies, and raw materials. British soldiers fought across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, while colonies like India sent over 1 million men to fight in support of the British cause. While the war ended with the victory of the Allied powers, it came at an incredibly high cost. The British economy was devastated by the war, with massive debts that would take decades to repay. The human toll was staggering, with over 1 million British soldiers dead and countless more wounded. The British Empire's military dominance, once unquestioned, had been severely tested and stretched thin. The social and political impacts of the war were profound. The 1917 Russian Revolution and the Russian withdrawal from the war had shown that imperial powers could be overthrown from within. Britain's own colonies began to demand greater self-determination, inspired by the notions of national self-determination that emerged from the war, particularly after President Woodrow Wilson's famous speech about the right of nations to govern themselves. The end of the war marked the beginning of a wave of unrest and nationalism across British-controlled regions. After the end of the war, the British Empire found itself in a perilous economic situation. The cost of the war had pushed Britain into debt, and much of the empire's industrial and financial infrastructure was badly damaged. In the 1920s, Britain struggled to recover from the economic fallout of the war. The Great Depression of the 1930s only deepened the crisis. The British economy, heavily reliant on trade with its colonies and its global influence, was severely affected by the worldwide collapse of markets. Colonies such as India, which had provided crucial resources and manpower during the war, began to demand greater autonomy as they struggled with economic hardship and the aftermath of the global downturn. At the same time, new powers were rising on the global stage. The United States and Japan were quickly becoming major players in world affairs, challenging Britain's economic dominance. Britain's imperial hold on the world was increasingly contested by both economic competitors and growing independence movements within its colonies. One of the most significant challenges to the British Empire came from within its colonies, particularly India. The early 20th century saw the rise of Indian nationalism, driven by a growing desire for independence and self-rule. The Indian National Congress Inc., founded in the late 19th century, had originally sought greater autonomy within the British Empire. However, as the 20th century progressed, the INC, under leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, began to demand full independence from British rule. Gandhi's non-cooperation movement in the 1920s and his later Salt March in 1930 were pivotal moments in the Indian struggle for independence. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violent resistance won him widespread support, both in India and internationally. His efforts drew attention to the harsh realities of British colonial rule, including the economic exploitation of India and the discriminatory policies that kept millions of Indians in poverty. The British response to this growing movement was often brutal, with peaceful protests being met with violence. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919, where British troops opened fire on a peaceful gathering of Indian civilians, marked a turning point in the relationship between Britain and India. The massacre galvanized Indian resistance and turned public opinion even further against British rule. The British Empire, already weakened by the strains of the First World War, was unable to quell the growing calls for independence. In 1947, after years of protests, political maneuvering, and negotiations, India was granted independence. The partition of India led to the creation of two new nations, India and Pakistan, and marked the end of British colonial rule in the subcontinent. In 1956, the Suez Crisis dealt a devastating blow to Britain's imperial ambitions. The Suez Canal, which had been a vital trade route linking the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, was under British and French control. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal, Britain, along with France, attempted to intervene militarily to maintain control over this strategic waterway. The military action was a failure, and the international backlash was severe. The United States, which was emerging as the dominant global superpower after World War II, refused to support Britain and France, insisting that the crisis be resolved diplomatically. The Soviet Union also condemned the military intervention, further isolating Britain on the world stage. The Suez Crisis exposed the reality that Britain, once the dominant imperial power, was no longer able to dictate world affairs. The crisis marked a symbolic end to Britain's imperial, as it became clear that the United Kingdom no longer had the military or political clout to maintain its empire. In the years following World War II, the process of decolonization swept across the globe. Colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean began to demand independence, spurred on by the ideals of freedom and self-determination that had emerged in the wake of the war. The British Empire, already weakened by the economic devastation of the war and the growing strength of nationalist movements, could not resist the tide of decolonization. One by one, Britain's colonies gained independence. Countries such as Ghana, 1957, Nigeria, 1960, and Kenya, 1963, broke free from British rule, signaling the end of Britain's hold over much of its empire. The British response to decolonization was mixed. While some leaders accepted the need for independence, others resisted, fearing the loss of Britain's global influence. The loss of India in 1947 had been a tremendous blow. But the wave of independence movements in Africa and Asia confirmed that the empire was in irreversible decline. By the 1960s and 1970s, the British Empire had all but dissolved. The former colonies, now independent nations, began to chart their own paths, free from British control. The United Kingdom itself had begun to shift its focus away from imperial matters. Britain's membership in the European Economic Community, EEC, in 1973 reflected the changing priorities of the country, as it sought to rebuild its economy and political influence in a post-imperial world. The dissolution of the British Empire did not mean the end of Britain's influence in global affairs, but it marked the end of the colonial era. The British Empire, once the largest and most powerful empire in history, was no more. In its place, a new world order emerged, one in which the United States and the Soviet Union became the dominant superpowers. While the British Empire may have crumbled, its legacy lived on through the Commonwealth of Nations, an organization of former colonies that continued to share cultural, economic, and political ties with the United Kingdom. The Commonwealth, though no longer an imperial institution, remains a testament to the historical connections between Britain and its former colonies. In the next act, we will explore the legacy of the British Empire in the modern world, examining both the positive contributions it made to global trade, language, and governance, as well as the lasting impact of its exploitation, inequality, and oppression. As the British Empire unraveled during the 20th century, Britain found itself navigating a rapidly changing world. The wave of decolonization that swept across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean left Britain with fewer colonies, but the aftermath of imperialism would linger in ways both seen and unseen. The collapse of empire didn't immediately diminish Britain's influence on the world stage. Instead, it shifted the nature of that influence, particularly through the enduring connections formed during centuries of imperial rule. Britain's legacy, post-empire, became a dual-edged sword marked by both positive and negative outcomes. While the empire brought the world closer together in terms of trade, language, and governance, it also left behind a deep scar of exploitation, inequality, and division. In the years following World War II, former colonies gained independence, but the ramifications of their colonial experiences would have lasting effects on both their development and the development of the modern British state. One of the more enduring legacies of the British Empire was the creation of the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies, dominions, and territories that shared cultural, political, and historical ties with Britain. This new form of unity was intended to replace the British Empire, transforming a system of direct colonial rule into a more equal relationship between Britain and its former colonies. The Commonwealth, which now consists of 56 member states, remains one of the most significant legacies of the British Empire. While it no longer operates as an imperial system, the Commonwealth maintains political and economic cooperation, often focused on shared interests in trade, education, culture, and international development. Britain itself, while no longer a global empire, continued to wield influence in the international arena as a founding member of the United Nations and a permanent member of the Security Council. The country also played a key role in the establishment of the World Trade Organization (WTO), and its economy continued to be one of the largest in the world, despite its diminished imperial control. The Commonwealth, however, was not without its tensions. Many former colonies resented the continued influence of Britain, particularly in terms of trade practices and diplomatic influence. Some countries, like India, Pakistan, and South Africa, eventually distanced themselves from the Commonwealth, seeking to forge their own identities free from British influence. But for many, the Commonwealth continues to serve as a reminder of the shared history and potential for future cooperation across former colonial borders. One of the most far-reaching legacies of the British Empire is the global dominance of the English language. Today, English is the most widely spoken second language in the world, and it has become the international language of business, diplomacy, and academia. The empire's spread of English, often through formal education systems, allowed for communication and cooperation long after the empire's dissolution. The British Empire's influence also extended to global trade networks. The Royal Navy had once dominated the seas, securing the empire's control over vital trade routes. Today, British commercial institutions and financial hubs like London continue to play a significant role in the world's economy. The city remains one of the largest financial centres, and the pound sterling is one of the most important currencies globally in terms of cultural influence. The British Empire's global reach brought British literature, music, and education to all corners of the world. Icons like Shakespeare and the Beatles remain influential worldwide, and British universities such as Oxford and Cambridge continue to attract students from every continent. However, this widespread cultural influence has come under scrutiny, as it is also viewed as part of the Empire's efforts to impose British values on colonized peoples. The legacy of British cultural imperialism has been challenged by post-colonial thinkers and activists, who argue that the British Empire's cultural reach often overshadowed the traditions and identities of the colonized. While the British Empire's legacy includes positive aspects like the spread of language and trade, it also has a darker side, deeply intertwined with centuries of economic exploitation, oppression, and social inequality. The legacy of colonial exploitation continues to affect many former colonies, which, despite gaining independence, still grapple with the economic and social consequences of centuries of imperial rule. The forced extraction of resources, the displacement of indigenous populations, and the destruction of local economies left many countries struggling to find their footing after independence. In countries like India, Nigeria, and Kenya, the legacy of colonialism is visible in the ongoing struggles with poverty, corruption, and inequality. The forced introduction of cash crops and the system of land ownership often disrupted traditional agricultural practices and led to long-term economic instability. In many cases, The borders drawn by colonial powers in Africa and Asia did not reflect the ethnic or cultural realities on the ground, leading to conflicts and tensions that continue to affect global politics. The partition of India in 1947, for example, led to violent displacement and the creation of new nations in the wake of British withdrawal. Similarly, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which divided the Ottoman Empire's territories in the Middle East, has had enduring consequences for the region, leading to conflicts that persist to this day. The process of decolonization was not just about the political independence of former colonies, it was also about the rise of new national identities. After gaining independence, many nations sought to assert their sovereignty and rebuild their economies. This process, while vital, was often fraught with challenges, as newly independent countries faced the task of managing diverse populations, rebuilding infrastructure, and establishing stable governments. In India, the partition in 1947 resulted in mass migration, sectarian violence, and the emergence of a new national identity. In Africa, the end of colonial rule saw the rise of new political movements and leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, who sought to forge new paths for their countries while grappling with the legacy of British rule. Nationalism, fueled by the desire for self-determination and freedom, became a powerful force that swept across former British colonies. In many cases, the legacy of British rule was a complex one, marked by both progress and pain. Nationalist movements that had once fought against colonial rule now had to confront the challenges of building independent nations, often with inherited legacies of economic disparity, social division, and geopolitical instability. Though the British Empire has long since dissolved, Britain remains a global player in many respects. It continues to wield influence in international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the NATO alliance. The United Kingdom's status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council ensures that it retains a voice in global diplomacy. Economically, Britain has transitioned from an empire-driven economy to a modern market economy. While it no longer controls vast territories, it remains a financial hub, with London being one of the largest financial centres in the world. The UK is also a key player in international trade, especially through its ties with former colonies within the Commonwealth and through its partnership with the European Union, though its recent decision to leave the EU Brexit represents a major shift in its global positioning. Britain's cultural influence also persists, with the BBC, British fashion, and English literature continuing to shape global trends. English is the lingua franca of global business and diplomacy, and British universities attract students from all over the world, preserving the country's reputation as an intellectual and cultural centre. The legacy of the British Empire remains a subject of intense debate. For some, the empire is remembered for its contributions to global trade, the spread of democracy, the English language, and its role in shaping modern institutions. For others, it is remembered for its exploitation, its destruction of indigenous cultures, and the scars it left on nations that were once colonized. In Britain, the empire's legacy is being re-examined, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and increasing calls for reparations for historical injustices. Statues of imperial figures such as Cecil Rhodes and Winston Churchill have become focal points for debates about Britain's colonial past and its continuing impact on modern society, as former colonies continue to reckon with the legacy of British rule. The debate about the empire's influence continues to shape how the world understands both its history and its future. The British Empire, once the largest the world has ever known, may no longer control vast swaths of the globe, but its influence remains. From the Commonwealth to the global economy, Britain's past is inseparable from its present. As we look ahead, the modern world is still shaped by the lasting impacts of British imperialism, whether through the cultural connections of the Commonwealth, the lasting effects of colonial borders, or the continued role of the English language in global affairs. In the final section, we will reflect on the evolving legacy of the British Empire in the modern world, examining how former colonies have navigated the challenges of post-colonialism and how Britain's relationship with its former empire continues to evolve in the 21st century. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire found itself at a crossroads. The devastation of World War II had left the empire economically weakened, with much of Europe in ruins and the British military stretched thin. The war had altered the global balance of power, with the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as the two superpowers. The British Empire, once the largest and most powerful in the world, could no longer maintain its vast colonial holdings in the face of growing demands for independence from its colonies. Britain's wartime economy had been heavily dependent on international trade, but with much of Europe in ruins and Britain itself burdened with immense debts, the country was in no position to sustain its empire. The war had cost Britain not only financially, but also in terms of human lives. Its economy, once the industrial heart of the world, was now in dire straits. Britain's focus was increasingly on rebuilding its own infrastructure, rather than maintaining control over far-flung colonies. As Britain began to look inward, its foreign relations also underwent significant shifts. The aftermath of the war revealed the limits of British influence. Although Britain remained a nuclear power and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, it was no longer the global superpower it once had been. The emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, held the reins of global power, and the British Empire's days of dominance were numbered. In the years following World War II, the world experienced a wave of decolonization. The once immense British Empire, which had controlled vast regions in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, began to see its territories break free. The key drivers of this wave were the rise of nationalist movements in the colonies, the growing disillusionment with imperial rule, and the changing geopolitical climate. The Indian independence movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, had already set a precedent for peaceful resistance to colonial rule. India's independence in 1947, though achieved through long struggles and partition-induced violence, was a significant blow to the British Empire. The independence of India was followed by the independence of many other British colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. The British government was forced to recognize that maintaining an empire was no longer feasible in the face of growing resistance and the demands for self-rule from its colonies. The Suez Crisis of 1956 symbolized the end of Britain's imperial ambitions, when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military intervention. The goal was to reclaim control of the canal and assert British dominance in the region. However, the intervention was met with condemnation from the United States and the Soviet Union, and Britain was forced to back down. This event exposed Britain's waning power on the world stage. The loss of its military and political influence in the Middle East marked a turning point in the empire's post-war decline. In the wake of decolonization, Britain sought to redefine its relationship with its former colonies. The Commonwealth of Nations, an international organization made up of former colonies and dominions, emerged as a new model of partnership. This new organization was intended to replace the empire, emphasizing mutual cooperation and shared values over colonial dominance. The Commonwealth, which currently consists of 56 member states, became a symbol of Britain's enduring relationships with its former colonies. Unlike the British Empire, which was built on dominance, the Commonwealth was based on equality and cooperation. It allowed Britain to retain cultural, economic, and political ties to its former colonies, while acknowledging their independence, however. The Commonwealth was not without its challenges. While many former colonies embraced the idea of the Commonwealth, others were more focused on their own development and less interested in maintaining close ties with Britain. The gradual shift from an imperial system to one based on voluntary membership and cooperation reflected the changing global dynamics. While Britain's colonial empire may have dissolved, its cultural and economic influence is still felt around the world. English remains the global lingua franca, spoken by millions as a second language. British literature, from Shakespeare to the Beatles, continues to shape global culture. British universities, such as Oxford and Cambridge, remain some of the most prestigious educational institutions in the world. Economically, Britain continues to play a significant role in global trade. The City of London is one of the world's largest financial centres, and the British pound remains one of the world's most widely traded currencies. Despite the loss of its colonies, Britain's economy is still deeply connected to the global market, with former colonies often remaining important trade partners. However, the British Empire's legacy of exploitation, inequality, and cultural imposition remains contentious. Former colonies continue to grapple with the effects of imperialism, including economic disparity, social division, and lingering political tensions. In countries like India, Nigeria, and Kenya, the scars of colonialism are still visible in the struggles for economic development and political stability. One of the most enduring legacies of British imperialism is the challenge of identity faced by many post-colonial nations. As former colonies gained independence, they were often left with political, social, and economic systems that had been shaped by colonial rule. The British Empire imposed its own institutions, legal systems, and values on its colonies, leaving little room for indigenous cultures and traditions to thrive. In India, the partition of the country in 1947 created enduring tensions between Hindus and Muslims, with violence, displacement, and the creation of Pakistan as a separate Muslim-majority state. The British government's role in the partition and its handling of the violence that followed continues to be a source of controversy. In the Caribbean and Africa, former colonies often struggled to forge new identities after independence. The legacy of British cultural, economic, and political dominance left many of these nations with deep-rooted challenges, including corruption, poverty, and conflict. Many former colonies also continue to seek reparations for the atrocities committed during colonial rule, such as the transatlantic slave trade and the forced extraction of resources. In the post-imperial world, Britain's relationship with Europe became a focal point of its foreign policy. After World War II, Britain, in a bid to rebuild its economy, sought to form closer economic ties with Europe. In 1973, Britain became a member of the European Economic Community, EEC, which later evolved into the European Union, EU. However, Britain's relationship with the EU was always somewhat ambivalent, and the Brexit referendum of 2016 in which the British voted to leave the EU, marked a significant shift in its global positioning. Brexit reflected the desire among many in Britain to reclaim sovereignty and distance itself from European integration. The decision to leave the EU posed significant economic and political challenges, but it also marked Britain's return to focusing on global trade and relations beyond Europe. In recent years, Britain has seen a resurgence of debate about its colonial past. The Black Lives Matter movement, which gained global prominence after the killing of George Floyd in 2020, sparked renewed discussions about the legacy of imperialism. Protests in Britain led to the removal of statues of controversial figures associated with the British Empire, such as Cecil Rhodes and Winston Churchill. These protests reflect the growing desire to confront the darker aspects of the empire's legacy. Many former colonies continue to call for reparations for the crimes of imperialism, including the transatlantic slave trade, the exploitation of resources, and the destruction of indigenous cultures. Britain's response to these calls has been mixed, with some politicians acknowledging the harm caused by the empire, while others argue that it is time to move on from the past. The British Empire is no longer a global power, but its legacy continues to shape the modern world. From the Commonwealth of Nations to the global spread of the English language, the empire's influence persists in many forms. However, the empire's legacy is also marked by oppression, exploitation, and division, leaving deep scars in many of its former colonies. As Britain continues to grapple with its post-imperial identity, former colonies are forging their own paths, often struggling with the complex aftermath of colonial rule. The British Empire's history is far from a simple tale of heroism or villainy. It is a complex narrative of ambition, suffering, exploitation, and adaptation. In the end, the story of the British Empire is not just about its rise and fall. It is about the ongoing impact of imperialism on the world today. The empire may have dissolved, but its legacy continues to shape the relationships between nations, the global economy, and the cultural exchange that defines the modern world. In the wake of the dissolution of the British Empire, the United Kingdom found itself at a pivotal crossroads. The imperial power that had once controlled vast swaths of the world was now a nation among many, navigating the complexities of the post-colonial world. While the British Empire may have disappeared, its legacy and influence continue to reverberate across both the UK and its former colonies. Following the decolonization process that spanned much of the 20th century, the British government had to recalibrate its foreign and domestic policies. The empire's formal end was marked by India's independence in 1947, but the effects of British colonial rule are still felt deeply in regions across the globe. Former colonies like India, Nigeria, Kenya, and Jamaica, among others, gained political independence, yet many still faced significant economic and social challenges. The United Kingdom, meanwhile, was forced to redefine itself on the world stage. The aftermath of empire left Britain with both a proud cultural legacy and a complex history of oppression. For the UK, the 20th century was marked by a gradual shift from global dominance to becoming a middle-tier power in a rapidly changing world, often caught between global ambitions and the practical realities of its diminished status in international relations. While Britain was no longer an imperial power, it sought to maintain a sense of global cohesion through the creation of the Commonwealth of Nations, an organization that included former colonies, territories, and dominions. The Commonwealth, originally conceived as a form of diplomatic and cultural ties between Britain and its former colonies, evolved into an association of countries that, while maintaining shared historical ties, increasingly became independent entities. The Commonwealth allowed Britain to retain a sense of connection with its former colonies, providing a platform for collaboration on a variety of fronts, including trade, development, and cultural exchange. However, the notion that the Commonwealth could serve as a modern-day extension of the British Empire began to fade over time. As former colonies became more confident in asserting their own identities, they often distanced themselves from the UK, moving toward regional alliances and, in some cases, rejecting the legacy of British colonialism altogether. For many former colonies, the Commonwealth represented both an opportunity to work together with other countries of shared history and a painful reminder of their subjugation under British rule. For the United Kingdom, membership in the Commonwealth was a diplomatic necessity, but it also often underscored Britain's waning imperial influence. The 21st century saw an increasing number of former colonies like India, South Africa, and Pakistan seek their own political, economic, and cultural direction, signaling that the age of empire, both politically and diplomatically, was well and truly over. Despite this, the Commonwealth has maintained a symbolic importance. The enduring cultural influence of the English language, British institutions, and historical connections still provides the UK with diplomatic and soft power, even if it no longer commands the deference it once did. While the British Empire may have formally ended, its economic and cultural influence has persisted into the modern era. The UK's global trade network, once a product of its colonial dominance, has shifted in focus, but British trade and financial influence continue to play an important role. London remains one of the world's major financial centres, a legacy of Britain's imperial power in global commerce. The global spread of English, thanks to the British Empire's reach, is perhaps the most profound and enduring impact of imperialism. English is the global lingua franca, the primary language of international business, diplomacy, and academia. This widespread use of English has helped maintain Britain's global influence in ways that go beyond economics. British cultural exports, including literature, music, television, and fashion, continue to shape global trends. Figures like William Shakespeare, the Beatles, and the BBC are recognized worldwide, and British cultural institutions like the royal family and the University of Oxford still exert a magnetic cultural pull. The long-lasting cultural ties between Britain and former colonies, particularly in countries like India, Canada, and Australia, have also kept the notion of Britishness alive. However, this cultural legacy is now part of an increasingly complex post-imperial identity, where former colonies challenge the dominance of British values, institutions, and norms, often redefining them through their own cultural lenses. In modern Britain, the legacy of the empire is both a source of pride and deep-seated controversy. The question of what it means to be British today is inextricably linked with the nation's colonial history. The royal family, long associated with Britain's imperial past, serves as both a symbol of national unity and a reminder of the British monarchy's role in the empire's global reach. At the same time, questions about Britain's role in the slave trade, the subjugation of indigenous populations, and the violence of colonial warfare have sparked heated debates about the morality of the empire and its long-term consequences. Over the past several decades, there has been an increasing push in Britain to confront its colonial pass-down effort, largely driven by former colonies and their diaspora communities. The Black Lives Matter movement, the ongoing discussion about statues commemorating imperial figures, and debates over reparations have forced the British public to reckon with the darker aspects of its history. High-profile cases, like the removal of Cecil Rhodes' statue at Oxford University or calls for reparations for the descendants of enslaved people, underscore the tension between Britain's imperial pride and the moral reckoning it faces as a post-imperial society. The British government has made some efforts to acknowledge and address its colonial history. In 1997, for example, Tony Blair issued an apology for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in India, where British forces killed hundreds of unarmed civilians in 1919. However, calls for a fuller reckoning, including formal apologies and reparations, have often been dismissed or downplayed by mainstream politicians, leading to a continued tension between public memory and historical accountability. In recent years, Britain has undergone a political and cultural transformation. The most significant of these changes has been Brexit Britain's decision to leave the European Union in 2016. For many in Britain, Brexit represented a desire to regain national sovereignty and distance the country from European integration. In the wake of its imperial past, some saw the EU as an institution that eroded Britain's ability to act independently, whereas others viewed Brexit as an opportunity to forge new trade agreements and partnerships across the globe post-Brexit. Britain has been forced to redefine its global role. The Commonwealth has been one avenue for Britain to reassert its diplomatic and economic influence, seeking new trade deals with former colonies. Countries like Australia, India, and Canada have become key trading partners in the post-Brexit era, and Britain's historical ties to these countries have helped facilitate smoother relations. Yet, the political reality is far more complicated, as former colonies have increasingly sought to chart their own courses and assert their independence from Britain's influence. While Britain continues to grapple with its imperial past, many former colonies have embarked on their own journeys of identity, self-determination, and decolonization. Nations like India, South Africa, Kenya, and Jamaica have made significant strides in achieving political and economic sovereignty. However, the post-colonial world still faces the lasting impacts of British imperialism, economic disparities, fractured societies, and tensions with ethnic or cultural groups that were often divided by arbitrary colonial borders. In India, for example, the legacy of the British Empire has left behind a complex socio-political structure with divisions between religious communities and a deep history of economic exploitation. Similarly, African nations, such as Kenya and Nigeria, continue to grapple with the effects of British colonial rule, including the economic inequalities fostered by British land policies and the exploitation of resources. At the same time, former colonies like India, Canada, and Australia have become vibrant, independent nations with strong global identities. These nations, once under British control, have carved out their own distinct political, social, and economic paths, free from imperial control but still deeply connected to their shared history with Britain. The British Empire may no longer exist in its former capacity, but its legacy continues to shape the modern world. The empire's rise, expansion, and eventual decline provide critical lessons about power, governance, and the human costs of empire. For Britain, the question of its identity is tied up with the complex history of imperialism as the country navigates its post-imperial role in the world. For the former colonies, the legacy of British rule is both a source of pride and pain. As nations seek to reconcile their pasts with their futures, as the global order continues to evolve, the legacies of empire, both positive and negative, remain. While the British Empire may have dissolved, its impact on the world is undeniable, and the conversations about its legacy will continue to shape the political, cultural, and economic landscapes of the 21st century. The British Empire was, without a doubt, one of the most powerful and influential empires in world history. Spanning continents and cultures, its reach was vast, its dominance nearly unquestioned, and its legacy complex, contentious, and profound continues to resonate across the globe. Today, as former colonies, territories, and regions continue to navigate the aftershocks of colonialism, the British Empire's narrative remains one of the most debated and scrutinized historical legacies. The Empire's impact on the modern world cannot be overstated. In this conclusion, we reflect on the far-reaching consequences of the British Empire, the evolution of the modern world order, and the ongoing negotiations over historical memory, identity, and global relations. The British Empire's rise was driven by ambition. What began as a small island kingdom embroiled in survival against Viking invasions, led by figures like Alfred the Great, evolved over centuries into a global empire that controlled vast territories spanning the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The British managed this extraordinary expansion, in part, through remarkable innovations in navigation, shipbuilding, and military strategy, establishing dominance on the seas that would define much of the empire's success. But alongside military prowess, the economic engine of the empire was equally important. Trade, whether in spices, textiles, tea, or opium, became the primary vehicle of British power. However, beneath the pursuit of wealth and prestige lay exploitation. The economic structure of the British Empire was built on the back of forced labor and displacement, with the transatlantic slave trade being one of its most profitable yet darkest enterprises. Millions of Africans were torn from their homes and subjected to inhumane conditions in the Americas, fueling the empire's industrial growth while simultaneously causing untold suffering. The use of enslaved labor in the Caribbean, North America, and India was a primary source of wealth for Britain. But it also marked a moral hypocrisy. While Britain prided itself on being a beacon of civilization, it subjected millions of people to slavery, violence, and economic deprivation. This paradox, the tension between Britain's image as a progressive force and the reality of its colonial brutality, was evident throughout the empire's history. The so-called civilizing mission was frequently at odds with the actions taken to secure resources, maintain control, and suppress resistance. The harshness of British rule in countries like India, Kenya, and South Africa would eventually lead to uprisings, resistance movements, and the eventual dismantling of the empire. The British Empire's decline began in earnest after World War II. The war had not only devastated Britain's economy, but also marked a turning point in global geopolitics. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two dominant superpowers, fundamentally shifting the global balance of power. In this new world order, the old imperial system was no longer sustainable. Britain, bankrupt and weakened by the war, could no longer hold onto its colonial possessions. The cost of maintaining an empire was simply too high, both in terms of finances and human resources. The most significant blow to the British Empire came in 1947 with the independence of India, the jewel in the imperial crown. The partition of India into two nations, India and Pakistan, was a moment of both celebration and tragedy. While it marked the end of British rule in South Asia, it also led to widespread violence, the displacement of millions, and deep-seated sectarian tensions that continue to affect the region today. Following India's independence, the wave of decolonization spread across Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. Nationalist movements, fueled by the ideals of self-determination and equality, rose up in former colonies, demanding independence from imperial control. The British Empire, faced with mounting resistance and the changing tides of international politics, had little choice but to relinquish control. Between 1947 and the 1960s, Britain lost most of its colonies, though some, such as Hong Kong, would remain under British control until the late 20th century. The end of the British Empire did not mark the end of Britain's engagement with the world, but it did signal a profound shift in how Britain viewed itself. The post-imperial identity that emerged in the years following decolonization was one of reflection and reckoning. Britain, once the central power in a vast global system, found itself grappling with its place in a rapidly changing world. The loss of the empire left Britain without the same international dominance it had once enjoyed. And in the face of new global challenges, the UK began to redefine its role through partnerships and alliances. The Commonwealth of Nations became one of the primary ways Britain sought to maintain ties with former colonies. Though no longer an imperial entity, the Commonwealth sought to foster relationships based on mutual respect, shared history, and economic cooperation. The Commonwealth allowed Britain to maintain some of its former influence, though it was no longer an institution of control. Former colonies were free to shape their own destinies, and over time, the Commonwealth became a network of independent nations, some of whom still retained symbolic ties to the British monarchy. In the post-imperial period, however, Britain also faced the challenges of reckoning with its colonial past. The question of what Britain owes its former colonies, whether through reparations, apologies, or greater acknowledgement of its historical wrongs, remains a point of contention. The Black Lives Matter movement, which began in the United States but spread worldwide, reignited debates about the legacy of British imperialism, particularly in terms of slavery and colonial exploitation. The ongoing discussions about statues of colonial figures and the demand for a more honest recounting of Britain's history underscore the unresolved tensions between national pride and historical accountability. While the political empire has ended, the economic legacy of the British Empire continues to shape global markets today. The empire's network of trade routes, infrastructure, and resources laid the foundation for the modern global economy. The legacy of Britain's colonialism is particularly evident in the global economic systems that continue to benefit from the resources and wealth extracted from former colonies. For many former colonies, the economic structures put in place by Britain during the colonial era have had lasting effects. In many cases, economies were structured around the extraction of raw materials for export to Britain, which led to long-term economic imbalances. Colonial powers prioritized the production of cash crops and the establishment of resource extraction industries, often at the expense of the development of local economies, industries, and infrastructure. This has left many former colonies struggling with the legacies of underdevelopment, resource depletion, and dependence on global markets, controlled by Western powers. In countries like India, Nigeria, and South Africa, the struggle for economic sovereignty continues. These nations, though independent, must navigate the economic and political systems shaped by centuries of British rule. Global trade policies, corporate interests, and the effects of neocolonialism, the economic domination of former colonies by multinational corporations continue to keep many countries locked in a cycle of economic dependency. One of the most enduring aspects of the British Empire is its cultural legacy. The spread of the English language through the empire has created a global lingua franca, enabling communication, trade, and diplomacy across borders. Today, English is the primary language of business, science, and technology, spoken by millions worldwide as a second language. This linguistic influence has made English a key tool in the global exchange of ideas that are still deeply tied to British educational, literary, and media traditions. In addition to the language, British cultural products, music, film, and television continue to exert global influence. British writers such as Shakespeare, George Orwell, Virginia Woolf, and Chinua Achebe have shaped not only English literature, but also global narratives about identity, colonialism, and power. In the realm of music, British artists like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Adele have become global icons, while British film and television remain dominant on the world stage. However, the cultural dominance of Britain's past raises important questions about cultural imperialism. The imposition of British values, institutions, and cultural norms through colonization led to the erosion of indigenous cultures and identities. Former colonies have had to contend with the lasting effects of British cultural imposition, leading to the development of post-colonial identities that seek to reclaim indigenous cultural practices and challenge the lasting influence of Western norms. The British monarchy, while no longer an imperial institution, remains one of the most enduring symbols of Britain's imperial past. The monarchy's role as the head of the Commonwealth allows it to maintain symbolic ties with former colonies, many of which still recognize the British monarch as their ceremonial head of state. Yet, the monarchy's role in post-imperial Britain is deeply contested. For some, the monarchy represents a connection to a proud past, a symbol of national unity and continuity. For others, the monarchy is a reminder of the empire's colonial history and a symbol of outdated power structures that are at odds with modern values of democracy and equality. The monarchy's role has shifted, particularly in former colonies, where the push for republicanism and independence has led to debates over the future of constitutional monarchy. The decision of countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to retain the monarch as a symbolic figurehead underscores the ongoing connection to Britain. While the growing republican movements in some Commonwealth nations signal a desire to break free from the remnants of imperialism, the decolonization process may have ended the British Empire's formal control over its colonies, but the wounds of empire are far from healed. Many post-colonial nations continue to struggle with the legacies of British rule, including economic exploitation, racial and ethnic divisions, and the loss of indigenous cultures and traditions. Former colonies that gained independence have faced tremendous challenges, not just in rebuilding their economies, but in creating political systems that are not tainted by the colonial structures imposed upon them. The calls for reparations both for slavery and for the extraction of resources gained momentum in recent years. Movements in the UK, such as the demand for reparations from the British government for its role in the transatlantic slave trade, reflect a broader reckoning with the nation's colonial history. Whether or not these calls will lead to tangible outcomes remains uncertain, but they highlight the ongoing struggle for justice and reconciliation in the post-colonial world. As we look forward, the legacy of the British Empire is one that demands careful reflection. While Britain has moved beyond its imperial past, the modern world remains shaped by the empire's global influence. The challenge for Britain and for the world is to acknowledge the full scope of that influence, understanding both the positive contributions it made and the profound harm it caused. This complex legacy requires a balanced approach, one that recognizes both the cultural exchanges that shaped modern civilization and the injustices of imperial domination. The future of Britain and its former colonies lies in collaboration, mutual understanding, and respect. The post-imperial world is one in which former colonies have risen to become global players in their own right, while Britain continues to play a role in global governance. The path forward is not about returning to the past, but forging a future that is equitable and just, one where the mistakes of empire are not forgotten but serve as lessons for creating a better world for all.